Well, I want to welcome you to what may be one of the most difficult and yet most important briefings that we've given. That's certainly in a long time. In fact, Twilight's last Gleaming was a briefing package that we published 9 years ago. So in a sense, we're revisiting some of the predictions of that one and more directly taking a look at what's happening around us. But before I start really getting into it, let me be candid. In many ways, this is one of the most difficult briefings for me to give. Because as most of you that know me well, know that I'm not, in a natural sense, an America basher. I wanted to remind you that I spent a 30-year career in the strategic arena. When other people were in college, I was passing in review on Warden Field at the Naval Academy among a regiment that was serious and willing to give their lives for this country. And after a service career in the Air Force and some time in think tanks supporting the intelligence community, I also ended up being chairman and chief executive officer of 6 different public companies, 4 of which were publicly traded defense contractors. So when you spend 30 years among the strategic community, it gets in your blood. And so it's not easy for me to come to the conclusions that this briefing will summarize. So you need to understand that. It's very, very difficult. You see, when I was an impressionable teenager in the Boy Scouts, it was God and country. You didn't have to choose between them. And now I reflect back on much of my life and regard some of it at least as a misguided patriotism that was really a form of idol worship. So we need to recalibrate ourselves, and this maybe is exactly what God is intending here. So let's just jump in. Twilight's Last Gleaming, Part 1. You know, as we travel around this country, we usually follow our formal presentation with a question and answer period, and they're always the most fun, because it's fun to be scratching where people are itching, and we enjoy it the most. I think the audiences do. But as we do that, there are 2 questions that we can predict will come up from any substantial audience. The first one, they always ask, where is the United States in prophecy? Anyone that's studied Bible prophecy seriously becomes quickly aware of the fact that all the major players in the end times are well identified in the Scripture. And yet, it seems that the United States is conspicuous in its absence of mention. So many people that are serious about their Bible study find that puzzling, and they have many conjectures that come up. There's a second question that comes up. It's a close cousin of that one, and that is, why hasn't God judged America? Anyone that's really spiritually mature is disturbed by the realities of this country. We've become the primary exporter of everything God abhors. Billy Graham quipped so cleverly years ago. He said, if God doesn't judge America, he'll have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. And many of us get very nervous about this situation because we presume that the reason God has shielded us from an overdue judgment is because of our commitment to Israel's right to the land. We take the biblical, we hide behind Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3, arguing that it's that posture on the part of our country that has protected us from an overdue judgment. That's conjecture on our part. Thomas Jefferson anticipated this in his own way back in 1781. He said, I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Very, very poignant. So we could go through a lot of different conjectures and scenarios that might answer both those questions, but I think most of us that are gathering here today are confronted with one of the most serious situations of our lifetime. It's the impending monetary crisis that's on America. We could talk about a lot of other things, you know, the nuclear threat, the cauldron of terrorism, Islam, a number of other things. But this one is confronting every one of us every day when we go to the grocery store or pay our rent bills, whatever. Possibly even losing our homes, maybe having lost a job and not having prospects of getting another one. We're in a serious crisis. You know, we always in this country have bought more than we sell. We buy more than we sell, and that we always have done that, by the way. That's not new. And we finance the difference by debt. If we're buying more than we're selling, we have to borrow the difference, and we have. Our current imbalance, however, is over 1,000 billion per year. This will be more meaningful if I show it to you graphically. Back in the 1990s, we were negative. In fact, it approached about 100 billion negatively. That's a lot of money, and many people were concerned about that at that time. From 1997 on to the year 2000, it grew by 4 times that. That's the rate at which we're digging a hole. That's not the depth of the hole. That's the rate we dig deeper each year. 400 billion. And that concerned a lot of people. You saw a lot of thinkers writing papers and concerned about that at that time. In 2001, it picked up a little bit, and we breathed a sigh of relief, sort of. But in the subsequent years, it got worse and worse and worse, where it is now off the charts. We're talking literally 1 trillion, 1,000 billion per year that we buy more than we sell. We live at the largesse, if you will, of foreign lenders that lend us the money to continue. We act like we're the richest country in the world. No, we're the deepest debtor of the world. Big difference. And it's coming home to roost. In fact, the Federal Reserve, their primary measure of their performance is what's called the M3, a measure of liquidity. And if you're, as an economist, or if you took economics in college, you know the M3 is one of the primary report cards of the Federal Reserve. Well, it's interesting that in March of 2006, the Federal Reserve decided not to publish the M3 anymore. That's the report card. They just quietly elected not to publish it. And unless you're an economist, that went unnoticed. If you were an observer of the financial scene, it was an alarm signal. And so that's from that point on, we have experts try to guess what it probably is, rather than for the government to admit how it is. The U.S. financial report shows, the U.S. financial report is done on a cash basis. But as a footnote at the end, they indicate that if they apply it according to generally accepted accounting principles, that's called GAAP in the trade, your businesses aren't run just on cash. You also have to have your accruals, your payables that you owe the people, and that sort of thing. The generally accounted, the GAAP version of the federal budget shows that the assets are less than the liabilities. And in their words, put simply, the Office of Financial Report of the United States says, that the official financial report says that arguments that the U.S. government is bankrupt have increasing merit. That was 2 years ago. So that technically is what bankruptcy is if your liabilities are larger than your assets. And we crossed that, the U.S. government crossed that bridge 2 years ago. So the idea it's bankrupt, it sounds like a technicality to many people. Not to people who are lending you money, it's not a technicality. Are we seeing just the tip of the iceberg? Every day you look at the news or read the paper, you see more indications. Auto sales, of course, we're just taking the last couple of months of last year, down 37% year over year. An annualized rate of about in the neighborhood of 10 million units. That's a level that we had not seen for over 20 years. And so, anyway, it's depression-sized decline is the point I'm trying to get across here. Unemployment, jobless claims for the week ending December 6th, just before in the Christmas holidays, were down 500,000, the highest in 26 years and growing. That's continuing. Mass layoffs, making headlines on a daily basis in finance, in manufacturing, in retail, in construction, transportation, you name it. 182,000 layoffs from big corporations just in the month of 1 month that we're tracking here. All sectors are in a deep economic decline, laying off workers en masse. Industrial production in general, down, not growing, down 5.5% in the closing months of last year. Making it the worst quarters in 20 years. And consumer confidence, of course, continues to go down, so we're in a cycle here. The cash index fell it was 34 in November, down to about half of that, less than half of that in December, and continuing. University of Michigan publishes a consumer sentiment index at a 28-year low. Interest rates. Some like to point out that, the interest rates are going down, and that if they're virtually zero, and that they're going to turn around soon. We believe it's just the opposite, and I'll show you why. 0% interest rates are an ominous symptom, not a cure. In a recession, zero interest rates are stimulative. If you can borrow cheaply, you can invest in equipment, new businesses. In a depression, they are not. They're terrifying. That means no one's borrowing to repair anything, repair the economy. The National Bureau of Economic Research finally, late last year, at the end of 2008, admitted that the U.S. has been in a recession since the fourth quarter of 2007. That's one of those little lines you may see in a technical report, not realize the implication. But if the fourth quarter of 2007 was an economic contraction, then the fourth quarter of 2008 is an outright economic collapse. No one wants to use the D word. It's a depression that we're in, but no one wants to admit it. All the data points show that economic activity right here and right now is falling off a cliff in unprecedented fashion. Any belief that this is going to be a short and shallow recession or even a long and deep recession, but still a recession, is, in our opinion, woefully misguided thinking, wishful thinking. This is a depression, one that has only just begun. Something that most of us have never experienced in our lifetimes. Our parents and grandparents would know it well. They had the hardiness and the resolve and the sense of community to weather those kinds of storms. Investment survival. In 2008, there were 4 investment strategies that paid off and survived, at least for the time being. Cash, of course, that's if in the U.S. dollar. It had surprising strength in spite of the fact there was no basis for it. Government bonds were, that is at the Treasury level, didn't really crash last year, didn't do well, but they were safety. Gold, that's the physical, incorruptible store of wealth, surprisingly did exactly what it was supposed to. The other thing you could do if you were a sophisticated investor was to short, specifically in the stock markets, but any risky asset would have done nicely if you had shorted it, because most of them went down. The investment question, of course, continues, is what will be the winners in 2009, and I have yet to find anyone with a good answer to that. We monitor most of the sources here. This is a year when the financial crisis will have morphed into an economic crisis, not just a financial crisis, but an economic one. Big difference, more fundamental, affecting all of us. What about gold? It started last year at about $800, and now as it goes now, it's actually over $920, $940. In other currencies, it's done even better than the U.S. dollar. Gold has done exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting portfolios against carnage that was experienced in almost all of the financial assets. Almost everybody's portfolio did poorly, held on the gold situation. Going into the Depression of 2009, it still might end up being, from an investment point of view, one of the few safe harbor assets. In Canadian dollars, it went up 23%. In Australian dollars, up 29%. In British pounds, up 34%. In Icelandic kroner, up 95%. Of course, that government went broke. But so the point is that gold has been doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But the tremors continue. Citicorp, which was not long ago America's largest bank, and General Motors, one of the major industrial things, both on the brink of collapse. Downey Savings and Loan, collapsing. Home prices falling in 30 U.S. cities at the fastest rate in U.S. history. The multi-trillion Fed Treasury bailouts having absolutely no effect. I'll go over those. The International Monetary Fund's chief economist is warning that the worst of the financial crisis is still yet ahead of us. Most of the money that's been spent was bailing out friends at Wall Street. over $8 trillion so far, not a few hundred billion that the press talks about. And that's $8 trillion. That's more than all the entire world with foreign currency reserves of $7 trillion. And the lion's share of this goes to Wall Street giants, Citicorp, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, AIG, the insurers, and of course to the greed, corrupted executives who precipitated the crisis in the first place. Are we sending good money after bad is a question we all should be asking ourselves. Since October of 2008, the government has deposited $165 billion into 8 of the nation's largest banks. Okay? These banks are now worth $418 billion less than they were 4 months ago. In 4 months, those 8 banks have declined by over $400 billion. The government's preferred shares is worth at least $20 billion less than that. The rate of return is a minus 1,000%. The total lost among those banks since September 30th of last year is $335 billion. Each little box on the little chart on the screen represents $1,000 million. The total, Troubled Asset Recovery Program, TARP, from that program, monies were received by Bank of America, Citicorp, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo, just since September 30th. Against the $335 billion that they've lost, the government has given them $140 billion in the hopes of helping that turn around, right? Let's take a look at each one of these. The value before that handout of Bank of America was $159.7 billion, represented here by the same kind of squares. That was their value then. And they received TARP of $45 billion, and they presently are valued at $37.1 billion. In other words, the present value of Bank of America is less than the amount that they were handed by the government. That should give us some pause. That's a great job of management, huh? Let's look at Citicorp. Their value before the TARP was $110.4 billion. They were given also $45 billion. Their current value is $22.9 billion. In other words, about half of what the government gave them. So it's pretty pathetic, obviously. J.P. Morgan. Before the TARP, they were worth $174.1 billion, as represented again graphically here. They were given $25 billion to assist them, and their current value is $103.3 billion. So at least they're worth more than they were handed, but and their performance obviously on this measure is less drastic, but still disappointing. Wells Fargo, $124.7 billion before the TARP. They were given the smaller handout, the $25 billion handout, and they are worth, the present value is $70.5 billion. So they still had a $50 billion drop of value, in spite of the fact that they were handed $25 billion by the government. One of the most venerated of economists has said just a few weeks ago, it has been estimated that continued loan losses, will force U.S. banks to come up with an additional $1.4 trillion just to stave off bankruptcy. So, these $20 billion, $40 billion are just scratching the surface. It's going to take $1.4 trillion to stave off bankruptcy. Let's talk about the federal deposit insurance. Most of us get comfortable, well, our deposits aren't that large. They're guaranteed by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It's the surer. It insures $13.3 trillion in U.S. bank deposits in over 8,000 banks, almost 8,500 banks. They had less than $35 billion in insurance funds at the end of the third quarter of last year. That's only 76 cents for every $100 of insured deposits. In other words, less than 1%. So if there's a run on the banks, how much good is that going to do? How can they participate, say, and just take one GE Capital loan guarantee of $139 billion? They've only got, $35 billion total assets themselves. The FDIC is just cosmetics to keep the retail customer from running on his bank. That's the blunt reality there. So welcome to 2009. Here we are. The data so far is from last year. The data has only gotten worse. U.S. housing starts fell a further 15% in the final month, 500,000, lowest on record. U.S. industrial production fell another 2.2% in December, to a 7.8 year-over-year decline. European industrial orders, not just here, in Europe too. Their industrial orders, that's a leading indicator of industrial production, were down 26% year-over-year, largest decline on record. Japanese exports plunging 35% in December. Global steel production, reported down 24%. Those are big numbers for declines. All over the world, there are dramatic rates of decline of economic activity being reported. You go on and on with the statistics. So what we've seen is probably just the tip of the iceberg. The U.S. stock market's off 50% so far. European market's off 55%. Emerging markets are off 65%. Russia's off 70%. Earnings for all the S&P 500 corporations dropped 22% just in the third quarter. Paul Volcker has gone public on his assessment. He says the economic slump has begun to metastasize after a shocking collapse in output over the past 2 months, threatened to overwhelm the incoming Obama administration. He made these remarks at the end of last year in November before the thing. What this crisis reveals is a broken financial system like no other in my lifetime. That's Paul Volcker's assessment. Normal monetary policy is not able to get money flowing. There's been a leveraging in the economy beyond imagination. The trouble is that even with all the government intervention, the market is not moving again. So some of these things might have made sense in November and December as we're starting to face this. As you get into January and February, we're beginning to realize that the effects it's not having any effect. Global merchandise trade is experiencing a steep cutback. There's an indicator that the economists watch closely called the Baltic Dry Shipping Index. That attempts to measure the world transportation rates in ocean-going ships. And that's collapsed 90% in just 1 year. That means that goods are not being shipped, they're not being bought, therefore they're not going to be made, and it's a vicious circle. As consumer spending declines, there'll be more, so will corporate sales will decline. That'll lead to layoffs, which will result in fewer customers and even weaker sales, etc. It's a vicious circle. It's an economic circle, not just a financial circle. One of the questions is, we're going to throw words around, speaking of $1 trillion. Most of us can't imagine $1 million, let alone $1 billion. That seems to be an abstract government kind of term. No, nowadays, $1 trillion isn't enough, and you'll see why. What is $1 trillion? If you were paid $1 a minute for 60 minutes of every hour, for 24 hours a day, for 365 days a year, how long would it take you to collect $1 trillion? $1 a minute, every hour, every day, for how long? How many years? 2 million. Take you 2 million to collect that. Jerry Corsi, who's one of our gold medallion holders, and we watch his career for many good reasons, has come out with his analysis that if you'd gone into business on the day that Jesus was born, and your business lost $1 million a day for 365 days a year, it would take you until October of 2737 to lose $1 trillion. That's another way of making it graphic. $1 trillion divided by 300 million Americans comes to over $3,000 per person that they spent just recently signing a bill that not one congressman or one senator had even read. We'll get to that. Jerry puts out something else. $1 trillion $1 bills stacked on top of the other would reach nearly 68,000 miles in the sky, about a third of the way from the Earth to the moon. That's another way of trying to grasp an ungraspable number. Our home galaxy, called the Milky Way, is estimated to contain about 200 billion stars. If every star cost $1, well, $1 trillion would buy 5 Milky Way galaxies full of stars. Maybe that reaches you. $1 trillion is a whole bunch, okay? From 1776 to the year 2000, the first 224 years of U.S. history, 42 U.S. presidents borrowed a combined $1.01 trillion from foreign governments and financial institutions. That's Treasury Department data. In the last 4 years of the Bush administration alone, they borrowed $1.05 trillion. That doesn't account the transactions of last fall. So they borrowed, President Bush and that administration borrowed more than all the previous 42 presidents put together. That's okay. Obama's already outdone them in just one stroke of his pen. So anyway, how do we get here? How do we get into this big hole? You see, back in 1977, we passed a law called the Community Reinvestment Act. And that's where Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are quasi-government institutions, were encouraged to subsidize subprime loans. Let's help these poor people get some housing. It was recognized over the last 30 years by members of the House and Senate, members of both parties, by the way, screamed that this needs to be fixed because it's going to lead to disaster. But the attempts to fix it were blocked by congressional corruption for 30 years. Barney Frank, chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Christopher Dodd, chairman of the Senate Bank Committee, were bribed by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae not to make any change. They're getting their campaign contributions from those agencies. They're not about to repair by putting overdue regulation in place. And I had to fight the temptation from making a rogues gallery here of Hitler and Stalin and add their faces to that rogues gallery, because these two guys and their associates have destroyed the lives of tens of millions of Americans. And it was deliberate. Also, something else, back in 1933, there was a piece of legislation called the Glass-Steagall Act. Unless you're in banking, you probably never heard of it. But it established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, in the United States, and it also included some banking reforms, some of which were designed to control speculation. Now, the arguments for this legislation are about 4 key pieces. Conflicts of interest characterize the granting of credit, that is lending, and the use of credit, which is investing. If it's by the same entity, you can have conflicts of interest. And those abuses is what led to the attack. And letting people who do the lending and people who do the investing should be separate, because the lending should be conserved. It's totally antithetical to the inherent risks of investing. They're different. They're opposite ends of a spectrum. Depository institutions, like a bank, possess enormous financial power by virtue of their control of other people's money. Its extent must be limited to ensure soundness and competition in the market for funds, whether loans or investment. Okay, they're opposites. What a banker does and what investment banking does are opposite ends of the thing. Securities activities are intrinsically risky and can lead to enormous losses which threaten the integrity of deposits. The government insures the deposits and could be required to pay large sums in a collapse as a result of securities losses. These were arguments that were written back in 1987, because the big event that I'm coming up to is they, in 1999, undid Glass-Steagall. Stupid. It was put there to prevent exactly what's going on right now. Depository institutions are supposed to be managed to limit risk in contrast to the more speculative securities business. That's the concept behind Glass-Steagall. And an example is the crash of the real estate investment trust sponsored by bank holding companies back in the 70s and 80s. They had some of these things. The RIATs and so forth had a problem, but it didn't metastasize into the banks because they were separated by Glass-Steagall. Well, in some of the provisions, such as Regulation Q, which allowed the Federal Reserve to regulate interest rates and savings accounts, were repealed by the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980. And another act deregulated the savings and loan industry in 1982. But here's the key one. On November 12th of 1999, the Clinton administration signed the provisions that prohibit a bank holding company from owning other financial companies were repealed on November 12th of 1999 by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. In other words, they undid Glass-Steagall. Big mistake. Hugely risk intensive by irresponsible legislation. Well, we've seen $8 trillion in stock values lost. The availability of subprime loans inflated the biggest real estate bubble in history. That's a second issue. In 5 years, the U.S. residential mortgage debt tripled from $4 trillion to almost $12 trillion, 300% in 5 years. But something else is occurring you need to have at least a glimpse of, and that's called securitization leverage. That led to the biggest credit bubble in history. They found a way to leverage these. They invented new forms of securities as a way of leveraging other loans. They're called structured investment vehicles, or SIVs. What an investor can do, he can borrow money by issuing short-term securities at low interest and lend that money by buying long-term securities at higher interest, and you can profit from the difference. That's great as long as those trends stay that way. However, they can become insolvent when the value of the long-term security falls below the value of the short-term security that was sold. That's what you got to watch out for. That's the risk you get paid a profit for taking that risk. Now, the problem with SIVs is they were hugely profitable for Wall Street, but they have some deficiencies. They're not regulated. They're not listed on any public exchanges. There are no standards. There's no open market, bid-ask like the NASDAQ or open whatever. There's no clearinghouse. They are private contract arrangements made among these financial institutions. They're unfunded with no guarantees. They have the peculiar characteristic that their specific performance depends on the balance sheet of the loser, not the winner. Over 20 trillion in notional values are in default as we speak. How far that's going to be reached, they still don't know. The experts in this field can't guess, because it gets a little more complicated. Because they started inventing other forms of this, collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs in the trade. These are loans that are repackaged as securities. They were first issued in the 1980s, became the fastest growing sector of the asset-based synthetic securities market. They're held by thousands of the largest financial institutions throughout the world. Dozens of varieties. It's very difficult to even categorize these because they're all each a little different. They're collateralized loan obligations, CLOs. They are backed by leveraged bank loans. They're structured finance CDOs, SF CDOs, backed by mortgage-backed securities. They're commercial real estate CDOs, backed by commercial real estate assets. They're collateralized bond obligations, backed by corporate bonds, or a mix of them. Collateralized insurance obligations, backed by, obviously, reinsurance policies, those kinds of things. Some of the most dangerous one are the credit default swaps. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they went from 14.9 trillion in value to 45 that were sold. Yeah, they increased by 300% within 1 year. And then there are CDOs made up of other CDOs, so it gets complicated. These bundled packages of subprime loans are now effectively worthless. They're based on the premise that markets would expand indefinitely and not contract, and that, of course, is nonsense. They're completely unregulated, massively and fraudulently overrated by the rating companies because they're insured by Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. False AAA bond ratings were given to specialized default insurance companies. AMBEC, MBIA, CFIG, and FGIC are the 4 standard insurers within the trade. And they're all in lawsuits now. 9 major insurers, over 80,000 corporate, municipal, and mortgage-backed bonds are in trouble and having their own credit ratings cut. Because as all of these things go, the people who are supposed to be passing judgment, in effect, you have the customer paying you for the service, so you have a tendency, it's a self-destructive form of thing. JP Morgan, their exposure is over $90 trillion. Bank of America over 38 trillion, Citicorp over 38 trillion, Wachovia about 4.9, and HSBC about 4.4, and Wells Fargo 1.5. And that was in the first quarter of last year. I happened to get an assessment of that. It's like a pyramid. Take the real estate at the very bottom and then start adding on top of that the SIVs, the CDOs, the CLOs, the CBOs, and the CIOs, and the CDOs of CDOs. And you have leverage on that real estate. And at the last year, as I traveled around the country, I had beneficiary of an assessment that was probably, they add up to about $700 trillion, not billion, $trillion. And the equity that's holding them up is less than 1%, 0.9%. Except I've discovered since I made those slides up that many of you have seen in some of my previous talks, it's currently estimated to be over 1.1 quadrillion, or over 1,000 trillion. And so if that equity, the real estate equity, is collapsing, what's it doing to the rest of this? A very doubtful value. So that starts to highlight why these attempts to stimulate the economy are doomed to failure. See, we made a transition. We used to be a producing nation. We were proud of what we could produce, and that production made us a strong country. But we shifted to being a consumer economy from being a producing one. And that leads to materialism, a materialism that is funded by debt. All of us as individuals buy more, we live beyond our means. So do our states. State of California, it looks like it might be bankrupt in a matter of weeks. And it's it's what, the 8th largest nation in the world. If separated, they used to make those boasts. All of us are subject to a materialism that's funded by debt. And the result of our materialism is excessive debts at every level, personal and corporate and government. Our personal debt, corporate debt, government, all excessive. So we have a total collapse due to excessive debt. Do we understand that? If we understand that, then the question is, what's the remedy? More debt? You see the futility of trying to fix this by borrowing more is a never-ending chain. I would say, everybody says, well, it's a failure of the free market. No, it's not. It's a failure caused by government meddling in the free markets. Central bank interventions, forcing the subprime mortgages, bailing out of failed managements. The free market thing would correct that. If you don't manage well, you go through bankruptcy. That's a cleansing process of the free market. And we're trying to prevent that from happening. There's also a concept, it's what on Wall Street is called the greater fool theory. But the end of that line is the taxpayer. And of course, unprecedented current accounts on the part of the government. They're spending too much. First one, central bank attempts to keep interest rates far lower than what free markets would have warranted, especially since 9/11, supported by the lie that inflation was non-existent. That was promoted. Not true. They hide the fact that there's a recession, and they hide the fact that it's actually become a depression. The existence of government-sponsored enterprises, such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were fueling ridiculous excesses in mortgage financing. Banks were ordered to, encouraged to say it in a polite term, to lend to people who could not afford the loans they were making. And that caused an ever-rising house market, and on it goes. Then there's also the moral hazard that ran amok as it became obvious that financial institutions can take egregious risks, partly because they became, quote, too big to fail. Once you establish that principle, the people accountable to those organizations are no longer vulnerable to a downside, because they know if they get into trouble, the government will bail them out. That's exactly what's been going on. And the government itself, the existence of an unprecedented current account deficit. On a cash basis, they spend more than they raise in taxes. And we're financed by government-run foreign institutions, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds from abroad. And that has another whole risk. We haven't time to get into that one. So the travesty continues. Governments the world over are taking an increasing role in the functioning of the economy and financial markets in their own countries, and that's happening all over. But they're all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to solve the problem of too much debt with more debt. And it's interesting that every single solution they've adopted has been trying to get the good old days back, cutting interest rates to zero and so on. throwing money at the banking system so it can lend again. All these solutions have one goal: to bring back debt. But they're ignoring, at least for the time being, a paradigm shift. The markets are not buying it, literally. Debts continue to implode. Every bailout is being followed by an even more massive bailout down the road. The government solution has been to shift the debt from the financial markets to the taxpayer. Think that through. Is there a difference? Instead of individuals living beyond the means, we now have governments living beyond their means. Now substitute taxpayers for governments and you'll quickly understand how this whole thing's a farce. You're the suckers. You're paying for the people who could not manage their enterprises. Each one of these, we should also understand there's a whole law, what they call the law of unintended consequences. That's what happens when a simple system tries to regulate a complex system. The political system is simple. It operates with limited information. We'll call that rational ignorance. Short time horizons, low feedback, and poor and misaligned incentives. That's why our political system is dysfunctional. It operates with inadequate information. The time horizons are short compared to the decisions they're making. Decisions they're making have long-term effects, and yet they're concerned about getting reelected on a 2-year cycle. Short time horizon. Low feedback. They make a decision, they pass a law, it can be years before you realize the impact of that law. And of course, the incentives are mismanaged. Society is complex, evolving. It's a high feedback, incentive-driven system. When a simple system tries to regulate a complex system, you often get unintended consequences. Okay. Well, entrenched government bureaucrats are simple. They show no indication of knowledge or expertise of American history or even rational financial history. You go to any one of them and ask them who was John Law, and they've never heard of him. They hadn't even had a course in economics. The President, the Congress, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury try very hard to direct our economy. They don't have the background in the first place. It's an impossible task. With a GDP of 14 trillion, there are thousands of inputs and outputs that feed the system. Thousands of them. Their hubris leads them to believe that they are in control and can manipulate the gears of capitalism in a way that will produce their desired outcomes. No, the market is smarter than they are. If a desired outcome does occur, it's probably just dumb luck. The more likely result of their manipulations of our complex system is a set of bigger problems that had never occurred to them. I can't think of a body of people operating with more ignorance than Congress. They don't have time. They don't have time. They have 17,000 lobbyists that wine and dine them on a daily basis. Corporate lobbyists, PACs, unions, and specialty interests, they buy their votes. Yeah, they give them attention. Their time horizons are less than a few months. They're constantly running for re-election, raising money, handing out goodies to their constituents. That's the reality of the life they live. The only feedback they care about is their standing in the polls and the amount of money they've raised from so-called donors. Their incentives are poor and not aligned with the needs of the American people. They're not willing to do what is right for the country because they have no incentive to do so. Their only incentive is to get reelected by ensuring that their district gets as much pork spending as possible, and they do this by selling their votes to the highest bidder. That's the reality we face. I sat on a board with Bill Simon, who was formerly Secretary of Treasury, and I remember when I was on the board, he wrote a book called A Time for Truth, in which he, as former Secretary of the Treasury, pointed out why this country is out of control. There's no check on the Congress. There's no check and balance operative. It was out of control back then, and it certainly is. So let's focus. Let's not waste our time looking for causes, the economic blunders of Washington, the financial greed of Wall Street, or the big debts or risky bets by almost everyone. What's that got here? Let's not waste time pointing fingers. The Clinton administration for creating the tech bubble, the Bush administration for creating the housing bubble, or the Obama administration for giving us what promises to be a whole new government debt bubble. It is what it is. You and I can't change any of that. Why spend time on it? Let's not waste our breath debating whether the plethora of government actions and programs since 2007 are philosophically right or wrong. Let's not waste our time with that. The facts are, they failed. In addition to the 152 billion that the Bush stimulus package in the spring of last year, everybody forgets about that, and the 700 billion TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program of the fall, 152 in the spring, 700 billion in the fall, the U.S. government has loaned, invested, or committed the following. This is in addition to that. In addition to that, the government spent 200 billion to nationalize the world's largest mortgage companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Over 42 billion for the big three automotive manufacturers, 29 billion for Bear Stearns, 150 billion for AIG and 350 billion for Citigroup, 300 billion for the Federal Housing Administration rescue bill to refinance mortgages, 87 billion to pay back J.P. Morgan Chase for bad Lehman Brothers trades, 200 billion in loans to banks under the Federal Reserve's Term Action Facility, the TAF, 50 billion to support short-term corporate IOUs held by money market mutual funds, 500 billion to rescue various credit markets, 620 billion for the industrial nations, including Bank of Canada, Bank of England, Bank of Japan, National Bank of Denmark, European Central Bank, Bank of Norway, Reserve Bank of Australia, Bank of Sweden, and Swiss National Bank. 120 billion in aid for emerging markets, including the central banks of Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and Singapore. Trillions to guarantee the Federal Deposit Insurance Company's new expanded bank deposit insurance coverage from 100,000 to 250,000. Did you know that? That's certainly generous of you to back that stuff. Up to 500 billion in Fed purchases of asset-based securities, plus trillions more for other sweeping guarantees. The grand total is over $9 trillion and counting. You and I do not have the capacity to imagine what that means. That's larger than all the foreign exchange on the planet Earth. That's only 7 trillion total. These efforts were designed to stimulate the economy, to avoid a housing bust, to restore public confidence, to contain the credit crunch, to reduce the danger of global debt collapse, and to shore up sinking banks. And based on the overall net results to date, every single one is an outright, unambiguous, proven failure. That's the reality. The economy was not stimulated. Quite the contrary, it plunged at an annual rate of 3.8% in the fourth quarter and is expected to shrink by a whopping 5.2% in the first quarter, according to a survey of economists published last week by the Philadelphia Fed. The housing bust was not avoided. The S&P Shiller Index of Average Home Prices in 20 metropolitan areas has been falling nonstop for 28 months, with the most recent declines the worst on record. Public confidence was not restored. It has been sinking nearly nonstop, with the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index now hovering close to its lowest level in 28 years. The credit crunch is not contained. We've seen the biggest contraction in credit availability in recorded history. New home mortgages shrinking at an annual rate of $327 billion. Commercial mortgage shrinking at $56.7 billion. Commercial paper tumbling at $272 billion. And corporate bond financing plunging at $291 billion. And on it goes. The danger of global credit collapse was not reduced. It has actually gotten far worse. The evidence: the nation's 25 largest banks have upped their bets on the single most dangerous form of derivatives, credit default swaps. On average, the nation's 5 largest banks, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank, Wachovia, and HSBC, have increased their exposure to defaults. So it's getting worse. At the end of 2007, their average credit exposure in derivatives was about 264% of their capital, already extremely dangerous. 9 months later, it had risen to 317% of their capital. It's more risky than it ever has. And similar risks are rising dramatically in Western Europe, Japan, and the emerging markets. In other words, the global debt collapse is even more likely today than it was before the U.S. government began its massive interventions. The finances of the nation's banks were not shored up. They have actually gotten much worse. Just look at what's happened and you'll understand why. Ever since the nation's banks were told last year that the federal government was planning to buy up their rotting assets, they've been holding on, waiting, hoping. In the interim, dozens of banks have turned down bids from investors to buy their bad assets at deep discounts. They have strenuously argued that their assets are, quote, much more than buyers will offer, close quote. That's they're below market. They have flatly refused to accept fair market prices, and the government officials have nodded in agreement. Result? The housing burst has progressed and the foreclosure epidemic has spread. The value of the bank's assets has plunged even further. The bank's losses have multiplied, and the bank's balance sheets have sunk into an even deeper hole. Meanwhile, by accepting $45 billion each in federal bailouts, Bank of America and Citigroup, two of the three largest banks in the U.S., have tacitly admitted that they are failed institutions. They're living on government life support. They are insolvent. The massive Bush administration actions to save the economy failed. Now, the same evidence shows that the massive Obama efforts are likely to meet the same fate, failure. Never forget, everything you see today, the collapsing economy, the failing banks, and the continuing danger of global debt collapse is happening despite the most numerous, most radical, most expensive government rescue efforts in history, ever. Yet, rather than recognize their futility, the Obama administration is pushing forward with even larger actions, always with the same general goals, quote, to prevent collapse, close quote, and forever using the same blunt instrument, more government money. The Obama stimulus package is, quote, $787 billion. That's a label. That's not the amount, by the way. I'll show you what the amount is. $787 billion. That's over, by the way, that in itself is 5 times larger than the Bush package a year ago. It's 5 times larger than what Bush tried to do last spring. They promise larger attempts to save the sinking housing market, more money to avoid an even broader credit crunch, more money to prevent a more catastrophic debt collapse, and more money to shore up the banks that have now sunk into an even deeper hole. What's the first law of holes? Stop digging, okay? The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. There's another little dimension to this that we should understand, that freedom derives from a middle class. There's always an elite and always poor. But if you're going to go for tyranny, you've got to squeeze out the middle class, because the middle class are synonymous with a quest for liberty. I want to talk about the Hall of Shame. I've mentioned 2 people, Barney Frank and Christopher Dodd. There's 3 other names that have just made the Hall of Shame, as far as I'm concerned, who were personally instrumental in extinguishing the light of freedom in America in the last few weeks. Senator Alan Specter, Senator Olympia Snowe, and Senator Susan Collins. These 3 wearing Republican labels, their betrayal blocked a full review of the trillion-dollar spending frenzy that foreclosed any chance of the US dollar remaining as the world's reserve currency. If they hadn't signed, this could have been, a review of this could have been forced. But by them joining the Democrats, this betrayal caused this to slip through. It's very interesting to see the news stations publish film clips of the candidate Obama in his New Hampshire speeches, promising that in his administration that there be no pork, and any bill that comes on his desk, the public would have 5 days to review themselves online before he signed it, and he made that commitment and a lot of similar commitments. And we find that we have this thing signed. This 1,000-page piece of legislation was passed without being read by a single member of Congress in either the House or the Senate. It was posted online in a form that could not be keyword searched. encumbering people who are trying to get into it to find out what it said. You're talking about 1,000 pages. Before this bill was signed, the actual federal obligations were already $65.5 trillion. Without this. That exceeds the gross domestic product of the entire world. Take the GDP of every nation on the planet Earth, and it doesn't add up to 65 trillion. The Obama administration's so-called economic stimulus package is going to force the Treasury to borrow approximately $2.5 trillion in 2009 and another $4 trillion in 2010, with the result of increasing the current $10 trillion national debt by 65% in just 2 years. And it may be just the harbinger of more to come. So where are we headed? That's the question we all have. Hyperinflation? Possibility. The Amero? That's what the CFR is scheduled for 2010, a new currency. Fascism? We need to know what that means. Some say this is the end of money. The money supply in our first 354 years was about $1 trillion. 2006, we needed another trillion. 2008, another trillion. 2009, in just 4 weeks, we've added more than 2 trillion. I could argue 12 from a lot of reasons. 2010, another 10. The total credit market growing, of course, excessively. So some people see as these debts increase, you've got to borrow to fill the interest on those debts, and so it escalates, and the rate increases, and you finally end up in what's called hyperinflation. Has that ever happened? Boy, has it. Here is a couple of dozen nations that went through that in recent years. Let's take one that I'm familiar with from my family point of view. In Germany, from 1919 to 1923, my grandparents sold a restaurant to retire. When the escrow opened, it was enough to retire on. When the escrow closed, they had enough to buy a loaf of bread. Why? Because in food prices doubled every 49 hours. A loaf of bread in 1920 cost 1 mark, but a loaf of bread in 1923 cost 726 million marks. Famous hyperinflation in Germany. Is it unique? No, it's not. Greece did a very similar thing from 43 to 53. Prices doubled every 48 hours. The inflation rate ultimately reached a rate of 8.5 billion% per month, if you can. And these things go beyond imagining. But they happen. And when they happen, by the way, they happen suddenly. They happen suddenly. It goes out of control. And there's a lot of others we go through. I'll spare you that. But there's another thing that we need to understand. The Amero, that's a proposed currency to replace the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, and the Mexican peso. It assumes a North American Union. And one of the disturbing discoveries, of course, is that the Bush administration secretly was preparing to do that. And the ultimate goal here would have been a common currency for North America. And that, of course, was deemed by observers as ridiculous. Why? Because it would take a major crisis, massive U.S. government debt, unbridled credit expansion, prospect of major property collapse. That was published by Jerry Corsi's book, The Late Great USA, over a year ago. Was it 2 years ago? Anyway, 2 years ago. And he was at our international conference, and we recorded those speeches back then. When you start looking at this is why some people believe that this crisis we're experiencing is deliberate. It's been engineered to accomplish a larger goal by the globalists. That's a view that you can at least understand. Not necessarily agree with, but it's a possibility. It's interesting to realize that there was never an intention to defend our borders, because that would get in the way of all of this. There's another word here thrown around, but most people who use the word have no idea what it means. That's the word fascism. If you look at Webster's dictionary, it reads, any program for setting up a centralized autocratic national regime exercising the regimentation of industry, commerce, and finance, rigid censorship, and forcible suppression of opposition. Watch that carefully. Watch out for a thing called the fairness doctrine, which is a deliberately deceitful label. It's designed to throttle any criticism of the government on the airwaves. Correction, any criticism of the liberals on the airwaves. Benito Mussolini said it another way. Fascism should be more properly called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power. In Revelation chapter 6, verse 5 and 6, we have the third of the four horsemen. When he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. Black is usually associated with famine, and it's to eat bread by weight. And the next verse says, "And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Yes, this is famine, but it's something that most people overlook. It's inflation, runaway inflation that's going to engulf the world, not just the U.S. The term penny in the King James is misleading. It actually is the term for a day's wage. Inflation. Well, in our next session, we're going to deal with a vocabulary quiz. I want to show you the subtleties. We live in an age of deceit, and you want to watch very carefully as certain terms are misunderstood. We'll look at a few of those. And we're going to then, of course, address in all of this, you and I can't change it. What's coming is coming. We need to understand it. And out of that, develop a basic personal strategy to deal with it. Then we're going to talk about practical steps that each one of us can take personally. And we're also going to reveal to you some unique resources that are available to you that you might find helpful. So that's what we're going to look at in the next session. Let's stand for a closing word of prayer.